thought I might tell you then about, since you've been so kind as to come to me with, what I was going to, and what this particular lecture is about. I've been in the midst of finishing a book entitled Imperial Duress, Concept Work for Our Times. That's a set of essays I've been working on really since 9/11, since the towers went down, thinking about what empire looks like, how we can think about it, whether the concepts that we've been using to think in colonial studies are actually as critical and as radical and as opening as we've imagined them to be. And I think they're not. And so what I've done in these essays are kind of experimental in that each of them tries to take a different kind of concept and work with what it might be able to do and also what its foreclosures are and how it closes in upon us. But the other part of this lecture that I wanted to give and didn't have time for is something I've referred to, I don't know how many of you were there for it, is something called curative labor. And it's a term that I use to think about what various disciplines imagine the project is that they are involved in curing. That is, in making better, in responding to, in what their venture and their task is. So I might start actually with this issue of the curative labor and open to the Imperial Duress book. Because one thing that is interesting in thinking about philosophy and anthropology, even though we pose them, and throughout these lectures I've been posing them as interlaced and challenging one another and about one another, but not really, is that they seem to offer these really starkly different analytic capacities that might suggest that they're incommensurate, right? In so many different ways, in their dispositions towards knowledge and the practices that they endorse. But I'm arguing here that I'm not sure this is the case. That if we look to how anthropology and philosophy define their tasks, that is, these curative labors that they perform, the differences become more blurred. And in some ways more confusing. The confluences between philosophy and anthropology more evident. So regardless of whether each discipline puts the balance of their attention, both of them, in some fundamental way, think of themselves as therapeutic enterprises that engage in a corrective labor towards society. Right? They're always correcting whatever we've all gotten wrong. Some of these curative labors are shared, some aren't. Both, I would argue, see themselves as something that Foucault was one of the few to actually say, this is what I am. I'm not a historian, I'm not a philosopher. Do you know what he said he is? Does anybody know?
A physician.
Not a physician, that's what, so that's what Nietzsche said, that philosophy is cultural. Philosophers are cultural physicians. He said, I'm a diagnostician. That's what he argued. And what that's a diagnosis of is what's particularly interesting. Lots of anthropologists kind of resist that one either sees this as an appellate or as an accusation, right? Geertz, for one, held that ethnographers do not endeavor to predict as do good physicians. So that word prediction, diagnostic, Geertz interpreted as prediction. But that's actually not what a diagnostic necessarily has to be, right? That diagnosing isn't part of our task. But surely this is a very literalist reading of what a diagnosis is, and it's stubbornly ahistorical. And I'd argue it's pretty disingenuous. For what Geertz, somebody like Geertz, but not just Geertz, I just bring him up because he's one of the few to name it, have done. Hello, we're just beginning. He was constantly diagnosing why the Javanese shared their poverty, why Balinese loved cockfights, and what was happening in them. At the same time that he set aside that there was, the moment that he was diagnosing cockfights, there had been a huge massacre that was about to happen and that did happen at the same time. Hugely difficult political situation in Indonesia. So ethnographers are, as Nietzsche said of philosophers, probably the epitome of what cultural physicians are of sorts. And I think you could probably say as well as I do what they're set out to cure. The aversion, the distaste, the fear attributed as reasonable reactions to the other. It's all about the other, right? That's what we're constantly doing. We're always showing everybody that what you thought was so different than you is really not so different than you. And that the other is really the surrogate self, as Edward Said said, within us, and that we're not only domesticating but calming that fear, undoing what counts as reason, remedying the belief that what Euro-American epistemology has designated as the criteria of truth is natural in any way. So that's one of the things that anthropology is doing all the time. Not only that it's natural, but it's the most rational of all. If those who practice ethnography today are vigilantly self-aware of the moral allegory, James Clifford. Do many of you know James Clifford, or is he sort of outside your ken? Well, you would, yes. Is James Clifford a name that some of you do know? Somebody outside of anthropology, but who's been very, very perceptive about thinking about anthropology and its truths. He accused them of practicing anthropologists, sometimes say them, since I'm not always sure I'm an anthropologist, an elaborate art of ambivalence, about whether a suspension of moral judgment should be included among the criteria for contemporary critique and contemporary critique. Well, Judith Butler has an interesting take on that. She says, in her reading of Foucault's What is Enlightenment, she incisively sets out the distinction between judgment and critique, and she takes it up from Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams really is, that's where she gets her kind of traction, where he says, look, we've totally misinterpreted what critique is. It's not about pointing fingers. It's not at all about judgment. It's not about fault finding, which is, in a flash, how we kind of think of critique. She says it's an impoverished definition, and I agree totally. She writes instead, and I really love this because it's so succinct, and everyone says Judith Butler you can't read, and it's all so obscure, and people make fun of it, but it's not. She says judgments operate as ways to subsume a particular under an already constituted category, whereas critique asks after the inclusive constitution of the field of categories themselves. So critique asks after the inclusive constitution of the field of categories themselves.
What does inclusive mean?
Inclusive means included, occulté, hidden behind, put to the side. So it's interesting, before I ever read that particular reading on Judith, this entire book on imperial duress is about processes of occlusion. It's about how one gets parts of history that are not forgotten, that are not even misremembered, that are somehow set outside the grids of intelligibility within which we think. They are not necessarily unthinkable. They're not, as Michel Foucault argued, you can't even think them because we live in a different episteme. But somehow they are placed outside our purview in some way. And so each of these chapters tries to understand, one, the issue of colonial aphasia. How can the issue of colonialism constantly be there and not there in French history over and over again? How could we not see Hawaii or the Vieques, the islands in the Gilbert Islands, a whole range of sites that are somehow always placed outside empire, not part of that infrastructure or the architecture of them. So what I've been trying to understand is how our concepts of what an empire is and what colonialism is get in our way. It's not to try to define what colonialisms are, a better definition, but what they do. To start with the what they do. And that this issue of occlusive categories is actually part of the very dispositive. That occlusion is not something, oh, it's just on the side of social scientists thinking we don't have the right categories to deal with. But the kinds of categories that Hannah Arendt called that wild nature of the terminology, that she never does anything with, is actually constitutive of those relations themselves. But it's a lovely definition that Judith gives after the inclusive constitution of the field of categories themselves. And another way I put it at another time when we were talking is that concepts conceal the scenes of their making, right? That is Derrida thinking, Judith Kajtris-Viva thinking with her, all of us thinking what those scenes are though, right, that are concealed. That's kind of the job of ethnography. It's not only the job of ethnography, it's the job of aesthetics, it's the job of architecture, it's the job of all of us doing any kind of imperial work with people and things and places, where we look at, I think it's very exciting to think about how those scenes are concealed and what those scenes look like. Well, ethnography and philosophy have both imagined themselves as a therapeutic cure for the myopia and prejudices by which we all live. They offer very divergent responses to what the cultural diagnostic entails. So even though they may use the same term, some anthropologists, that they're doing, they're diagnosticians now, much more than they ever were. So that's a sort of area of convergence with philosophy. At issue is whether our prejudices must be put aside or serve us well. So one of the founding principles of anthropology is you've got to put your prejudice aside, right? Can't deal with it. Got to get it out of the way and maybe not be objective, but at least make sure it doesn't get in your way. And Gadamer actually argues the opposite, which I think is fascinating. Hans Gadamer argues you've got to actually work right from the space of your prejudices, and that's the only way that you could possibly get into it. The kinds of demands that it makes upon you. I think that's really, really powerful. Instead of trying to get far from it, actually plunge inside of it. So he says that's crucial to asking the right sorts of questions and, quote, acquiring the right horizons of inquiry. That is absolutely the opposite of the Enlightenment Project, right? The Enlightenment Project is get rid of your prejudices, dare to know, right? And dare to know so that all those prejudices and biases of whatever you believe about the world. One principal curative task that I think is exciting to think with is broadly shared between philosophy and anthropology, though they both claim it to be totally their own. And that's that notion that I brought up too and mentioned, to penser autrement, to think otherwise, to figure out what it means to think otherwise. Now that can also be interpreted in lots of different ways. You can think otherwise because you say, oh, I'm going to go to another culture, right? That's kind of the ethnographic reflex. Oh, I'm in another culture, therefore I'm thinking otherwise just because I'm there. The question is, are you? Do you? Are you necessarily so, thinking otherwise? Or are you thinking the other through the way in which you think that you are not invoking your prejudices to think so. So rather than pass quickly by this notion of penser autrement, which is a concept Foucault used that Deleuze really picked up and sort of flourished, thinking about it with Foucault, I like to think more that we stop there and pause on what it actually takes to think otherwise, and enable the possibilities of how to get there to be made visible. So it's not just, okay, I'm going to think otherwise. That's kind of chic. But how do you get there? What are the kind of subjacent architectural features that might get in your way? By providing the tools and by nurturing the cognitive and affective conditions to do so. So that's what we're constantly trying to work with, both cognitive and affective conditions to do so. It's in the sources of that otherwise that are not the same. So to think otherwise is how Michel de Certeau, with his mystic sense of visionary epiphany, described his encounter with the force of Michel Foucault's work. And this is how he describes it. It's sort of a trait of French theory and philosophy that they kind of sit and talk about each other a lot, right? Much more than we do in the States. I don't know how much in Germany. You kind of do a whole book on a rift. Deleuze does one on Foucault, and Michel de Certeau does one on Derrida, and Derrida does one on Barthes. But it does say something about the kind of congested exchanges that are going on. But de Certeau describes it this way, and I think it's sort of interesting. He says, in origin, in bouts of surprise, in the same way there are bouts of fever, in the sudden jubilatory forms of astonishment or wonder, which have been from Aristotle to Wittgenstein, the inaugurators of philosophical activity. So there's something there about epiphany, right? Something that exceeds the thinkable and opens the possibility to think otherwise, bursts in through the comical, the incongruous, or paradoxical half openings of discourse. I was thinking, Clementine, of sort of the exhibitions that you've done, and there is a sense of that play back and forth, right? First astonishment, but then is it comical? Then is it critique? Then is it that playing in that kind of space? Incongruous. What? Are we going to organize this by circles? Not by what they're supposed to be. The philosopher sees by an irony of things equivalent to an illumination. So that feature of irony is something that Vincent Crapanzano argues that is the hallmark of anthropology. But then de Certeau takes us to the hallmark of Foucault's philosophy. Again, there's something going on in this space. That theory is not just this tight thing that we work through Poulancis and Althusser, but something else happening at these sort of difficult moments. So the philosopher is not the author, but the witness of these flashes, traversing, transgressing the gridding of discourses affected by established systems of reason. That's sort of a really beautiful way to put it, and enhanced in some way by the very poetics of Foucault's own thought. The poetics not as something set aside from his thought, but actually critical to it. But there's something else that philosophy and anthropology share, and it's this notion of transgression. That the very best of whatever we do, and we get our sort of kudos for, is transgression, disruption, irruption, defiance of expectation. I'm not sure anybody who sees themselves as critical does not imagine that whatever they write and whatever intervention they make is a disruption of some kind, that they're not like everybody else. It's a turn from consensus. And it's really it's part of the academy, it's homo academicus. You have to play by the rules, but then you have to disrupt them as well. But not disrupt them so much that they become illegible. They still have to have a legibility. And there's some play there that I think is worth exploring, how much that becomes a signature of what the best has to be. It's always got to disrupt. And I realize it's very personal for myself. Yeah, it's always got to be disrupt in some way. Otherwise, it's not worth it. These are not only the hallmarks of our self-assigned restorative analytic labor, they are part of the restoration. They're what you're restoring is something off-kilter. You're refusing the smoothness of what Nietzsche called the garden of history, right? The garden of history. And where Foucault gets his ethics of discomfort. That the only thing worth doing should not be comfortable. And if it is, then you better question how you got there. These are the signature moments of critique, the means and goals in which we invest. They are the curative practices that both ethnographers and philosophers cultivate, and in which we take fulsome pride. So right there makes me uncomfortable with myself. Right? Why do I take such pride? Why do we all, in some sense, take pride in that? It is ethnography that teaches us that such defiance of and dissensus from the normative, the capacity to think otherwise, are not the purview of philosophy, by which it's claimed. Here's another place, so why are they both so strongly proprietary vis-a-vis that? When Jacques Rancière seeks to teach us, I quote, how to disrupt prevailing categories, unquote, and the logic of consensus that he so abhors, to rethink the political and distinguish it from politics, his starting point is Aristotle. Ethnography trains its attentions elsewhere, as does Stefania Pandolfo. Some of you may know her amazing work, some of you not. Anybody know her work? Well, she's somebody worth reading. She works between Lacan and Foucault and Paul Rabinow, and in Islamic philosophy, and in Arabic, and in North Africa. And she turns to young North African men who hide away in aluminum shipping containers in their often failed attempts to escape to France. They do not see themselves as suicidal in so many of the conventional ways we might imagine what a risk entails. They themselves, she works off what the case that they make, not what they believe, but the case they make. The case for other ways of expressing hope and despair, in terms that are founded in Islamic concepts that cannot be commensurated with the epistemic categories of Western philosophy. So this thinking otherwise has a very, very different kind of set of procedures that I see attached to it. Pandolfo tears at the seams of what we think we can know. She does not make it commensurable. She doesn't fold it back in and say it's just totally understandable what they're doing. Signaling one of the changed features of ethnographic work that draws it much more clearly to what Alain Badiou claims is absolutely the job of philosophy. He says, the sole task of philosophy is to show that we must choose. Its proper task is to elucidate choice. So that's really interesting too. Is that what doing philosophy is about, is elucidating choice? I mean, here's Alain Badiou, one of the most cited philosophers right now, right? It's to elucidate choice. Is that not what ethnography is doing all the time, but in a different way? And to recognize and acknowledge that the selection is founded on a criterion of incommensurability. That it's not about making everything fit. It is by Badiou's account in a paradoxical relation, a situation of rupture then, that philosophy can happen. it can take place. That's when it takes place. At this moment in which things don't jive, which you can't get them to be worked out, in which they don't just fold into each other, in which maybe a conversation is not even to be had. That's a really interesting definition of philosophy. Not when the conversation is to be had, but at that moment in which it's almost so incommensurable, which may say something about why Barbara Cassin, the French philosopher's new book on untranslatability, the untranslatability not only of words in different languages, but of ways of thinking. So part of what anthropology has always done is try to make it, let's understand everybody in our nice multicultural way, right? And some of the move is what happens when you retain some of that slippage that is the incommensurable, when things don't just become accessible. But surely any student of anthropology or history could also note the same. Paradox, again, is one of the signature features that anthropology, oh, you thought that was different? No, it isn't. It's really just like us. It just looked different. You know, you think that they don't care about their kids. Well, look what they're actually doing when you think they should be caring about their kids. They're actually doing that for their kids. So anthropology is constantly showing us that paradox of what you thought was different or what you thought was the same with totally different significations. Given the familiarity of that claim, the question may not be whether philosophy is anthropology's theory, which is what I started out with several weeks ago, but how fieldwork in philosophy, in its many guises, and even when it goes unnamed, reworks what Wittgenstein called the need for rough ground. What exercises of thought and forms of practice might allow us to move beyond Clifford Geertz's glib answer that it is the sacred, hollow security of ethnography that provides rough ground. So the next section here that I was going to give you at another time is on this thing of rough ground of Wittgenstein. It's just very short, so I'll just tell you the first few pages. If Wittgenstein once implored philosophers to seek the rough ground of ordinary language, and Geertz proudly imagined that ethnographic fieldwork was precisely that terrain, here I think it worth reflecting on the shared ethnographic conceit of that assumption. Geertz was among those ethnographers who long claimed philosophical topics as his rightful and proper domain. But ethnographic fieldwork in itself offers no guarantee of rough ground, I want to argue, or the traction that Geertz imagined it automatically confers upon us. One could argue that what counts as rough ground, ethnographically, epistemologically, and politically, are still up for grabs in information. And I think in some ways that is one of the tasks. It's one that Nietzsche was asking for, it's one that Foucault's asked for. How do you get to that place that just is not seamless? How do you get to that place that's not comfortable? How do you get to something that causes some kind of pause? Wittgenstein puts it this way. He says in the Philosophical Investigations, he says, we have got onto, in a bad way, we have got onto slippery ice where there is no friction. And so in a certain sense, the conditions are ideal. But also just the opposite of that. We are unable to walk. We want to walk, so we need friction. Back to the rough ground, exclamation mark. It's wonderful. I mean, who could Wittgenstein, be allowed in such simple language just to say, get back to the rough ground. So ethnographic fieldwork may be the site where we touch ground. I think that's different, where we touch ground. But fieldwork in philosophy implies something else. Attention to a complexity of lived ethics epistemic uncertainty and doubt among those with whom we work, and how we, in turn, work with their uncertainties and our own. So there's something about that space of the uncertain before you get to certitudes that I see as one of the most productive methodological sites to linger within. Not at the moment when the concept is readily congealed, not when the social situation is already formed and has a name, as Raymond Williams would say, it's already past tense. Not when the concept's already out there. It's at those moments, again, that perhaps are on the edge of conceptuality and non-conceptuality, when you have a language, you know.
Would that not be something like psychoanalysis, a rough ground? I mean, the actual, the
Yeah.
patient inform, I mean, the
Yeah.
patient, wouldn't that be
Yeah.
something that is
A piece of it, certainly.
being spoken,
Not yet.
represented,
In other ways, and not yet actually vocabulary for it.
yeah.
The problem with psychoanalysis is that then it reverts to a vocabulary that, in my mind, this is, because people always ask me, Anne, where's psychoanalysis in your work? You got Marx, there's Foucault, there's Althusser, there's Bachelard. Where's, because I feel like there's a kind of redemptive move in which, aha, it's the father part, or aha, that it turns to a kind of resolution in a way, that instead of staying within that kind of space and seeing what the productive sort of
Sure, but
way.
in the moment of utterance,
Yeah.
it produces a doubt, epistemic
Absolutely.
uncertainty. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then where does it go with it? What does it do with that? Does the ground stay rough, or does it end up being penis envy? I know, and I mean that cynically or not. Then it gets caught within a set of a rather stilted vocabulary, and then of course we understand that she's always had problems with her mother. That's the worry for me. It's not, you're so right, Clementine, it's not that moment of the doubt and the uncertainty. It's what's done with that to resolve it. Yeah.
I mean, that's interesting because, first of all, that's kind of the argument Deleuze uses in Untitled Chapter, right? And it's also interesting to think about psychoanalysis because in Foucault's Order of Things, obviously the counter sciences of psychoanalysis and ethnology, and then he kind of drops both of them,
Right.
right? And moves away in this so-called second phase. So
Absolutely.
he seemed to think the same at some point in his life. He seemed to think the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if he rejected, I don't think he rejected Freud as much as he rejected psychoanalysis and what psychoanalysis was in France, the whole Lacanian move at the moment when he was writing in the 1960s and 70s. Yes?
I think we have to keep in mind the special French situation.
That's what I was just saying.
Because the scene was all over dominated by Lacan.
That's what I just said.
Yeah.
Oh, you didn't hear me? I'm sorry.
I get only half of it.
Yeah, that's exactly, I agree with you
I'm
totally.
sorry.
Absolutely. It was a very specific situation, and he was intervening at a very specific moment in which Lacan and psychoanalysis was like swallowing up the air, the analytic and intellectual air so much that he turned away. But if you look at the history of sexuality, I think carefully, Yvonne Pidgey said, well, supposedly he rejected Freud. Actually, the whole thing is about this insecurity of a bourgeoisie that has to cultivate itself in a particular way. Did you want to say something? She's encouraging you. She's right.
Oh, no, I know what to say.
I asked you a stupid question. I wanted to know whether art practice was rough ground.
I think it is. I think it can be. See, whether it is, what can be? What would one need to do to make it so? You can't possibly say ethnography is rough ground, art is. It depends what is done with it, right? That's the potentiality that's so exciting. But to assume it is to stop asking the question. It's to assume, I do art, therefore I'm on rough ground. Or I do ethnography and I go to the field in Java and I'm on rough ground. No, that's too easy. And so that's the part I want to suspend. That's the part I want to hold. Oh yeah, I've studied colonialism 30 years. I know where the rough ground is. It's resistance. Well, no, I don't actually know that's the rough ground. It may actually be desire. That is part resistance, part not, part. So it's what domains can be reactivated that seem to me to be the most exciting. And for me, one of the areas that has been so important, and it maybe goes back again to recouping some of Freud, some of thinking about what's conscious and unconscious, what's tangible, what's intangible, what's available and what's not, is what it means to know and not know something at the same time. For me, that this has been, I haven't left it yet. I haven't left something that I taught a seminar on the politics of truth production for years, in which we looked at self-deception, and we looked at truth serums, and we looked at polygraphs, and we looked at confession, and self-deception is too easy. It's, deceiving yourself. But actually, most of the world in which we are living constantly, the political world we're living in, I'm convinced, we both know and don't know things all the time, that we both look away from and look towards and then look away again in order to survive. And in terms of the sort of political ecology in which we live, that's a space that interests me a lot. How we understand Marine Le Pen, what we understand about how much she and what she says is just like you and me and totally other in every single way. Which parts are set aside and which are not. For me, it's a very important, doesn't mean everybody has to be interested in it. I'm interested in those moments of doubt that are more than self-deception. I see this move in a sustained pause over the discernments and deliberation. So it's not to resolution, not the moments of decisive decision, which is usually the event, right, in a lot of traditional history. It's when the decision is made, when the treaty was signed, when the battle was won. Not when the decisive decisions are abruptly or finally made, but in that messier space in which the potential to act is held in abeyance. When you know you could do something, you could stand out there alone, you do or you don't, open to reflection and doubt, and then fails to congeal into a consensual form. It addresses what Vincent Crapanzano and Vina Das both urge in very different ways. So our work is so different. Attention to the multiple registers of affect, layered through speech, an approach to social lives and complex interiorities that don't just stay as interior, that Austin might see, and I would call, an ethnography of excuses. I love the idea of doing an ethnography of excuses and how they politically operate. And it's something that, those of you who were there when I did a sort of long thing on Austin, you were not there for that. That's something you would have liked, because it's the ways in which what can be excused, not excused, what counts as a reasonable excuse for looking away or not, or doing what one's doing, actually is a very politically charged and politically effective space to work within. I don't know anyone who's done an ethnography of excuses. Anthropology can remain committed to the belief that fieldwork is a place where we touch rough ground. But it strikes me that fieldwork in philosophy is where we have the possibility of redefining what constitutes rough ground, working uncomfortably, productively, and politically to identify what's rough about it. I think of it as a constant uncomfortable pressure to hone what it takes to not write charmed accounts of those with whom we sympathize. As Nietzsche argued, we are wont to always do. To quote, not shy away, this is Nietzsche, not to shy away from our rough and charmless needs and requirements. So for years I've been imagining that what I'm doing in anthropology as a historian of colonialism, is to write charmless histories. How do you write a charmless history that doesn't get us all feeling good about ourselves and about our differences from what colonialism was and did? Identifying that rough ground seems one prerequisite to writing charmless histories of the present, a response to Nietzsche's insistence that we do so. Austin's rough ground, again, this word rough keeps coming up for Austin and Nietzsche, right? Is the messy space around excuses and the actions they condone. Doing ethnographic and historical work set deep in the particulars of place and people's lives would seem to provide ready access, easy entry, immediate recognition that rough ground is in part where ethnographic work happens. Ethnographic work produces smooth narratives, and I think that James Clifford would argue the same, as often as it does recognition that people's lives don't always congeal into coherent narratives. Rough ground may be intrinsic to the worlds in which we attempt to gain some understanding and access, but to imagine that paradox is our disciplinary gesture may only allow us to do what is urged upon us, to make sense of a story, of a difference, and then tell a good story. So part of the challenge is, can you tell something without it being a good story? Or does the whole thing just come apart and unravel? Is that possible for it not to have the coherence of a good story? So the book Imperial Duress is in some sense a response to all of this. To do three things that I'll just mention. To look at the distributions of inequities that concepts condone, inscribe, and inhabit. To address the challenges of writing new colonial histories that press on the present. And not least, on learning what is imagined to be known about colonial governance and why those understandings and misrecognitions should continue to concern us now. So I thought I would, I could tell you about my included histories of empire and a reworking of, but I don't know, I could novels. Sort of this introduction is rethinking of Foucault's notion of discontinuity and a charge that instead of understanding these histories as Foucault being the master of epistemic break, that we turn to a history in a recursive mode, and that we instead understand that there are no histories with clean epistemic breaks, that probably the greatest challenge is to understand how histories fold upon themselves, and in those folds produce new planes as they fold differently. So it's not as if you ever get a repetition, nor do you get the same. You get new kinds of surfaces emerging within the pli, which is this word and this concept that Deleuze played with a lot, the pli, but not for looking particularly at what the nature of histories are, that in which new kinds of surfaces can appear with similar kind of elements being brought forward. And that's the place where I am actually in a lot of my work. How to not go, oh, it's a colonial legacy, oh, it's totally different, post-colonial is totally different, but what are the ways in which those elements fold in, have a sense of resonance, familiarity? Some of them become, as Lévi-Strauss said, easy to think. They have similar kind of forms, and then on the other hand, there are distortions that are totally different, as Ashimembe would argue, almost kind of aesthetic and erotic deformities that he argues what African nations look like today. He takes it pretty far. He says it's based on the colonial, but it's this deformation. And then you say, well, was it a good formation before and now it's a deformation? Or what do you mean? Or was it not erotic before? Or is it an exaggerated eroticism that he's arguing? It's sort of the phallic for him. It's like this huge nature of the African governments that are just taken over with their power, without power. It's interesting. He doesn't say it all explicitly, but he's looking for that space that's not repetition, but that pulls upon that which was there and takes it in another direction. And this issue, for me, it's all over Foucault. What's so interesting is why people have not seen it. So this project is about, and the thing I'm giving in Paris on Saturday, is arguing whether Foucault really is prêt-à-porter, is really ready-wear, and ready-made wear or not, and arguing that in fact we've gotten it very wrong, that it's not so prêt-à-porter as we've imagined. Anyway, these are the projects that
Sorry, I want to jump in because what I find interesting in what you've said is you just said something. You said how to write new colonial histories of the present.
that's right.
Did you say that?
It's exactly.
Okay. So where I think the rough ground would be is, and the difficulty would be in pronouncing something about what is going on now.
That's exactly right.
So how do you do that in your area? Do you speak now about, forgetting Benjamin because he's not here,
Right.
do you speak about process of occlusion with case studies that you can name now that are going on now? How do you make this graspable and put yourself in a rough ground, in a difficult position because you're suddenly making a political statement?
Yeah. Well,
Do you
the
have
first
a bit of
piece.
a case study
Yeah.
here?
Well, it's not case study in that
Well,
way.
okay, but an example.
But examples are each of the chapters. So there's one that Andreas had just asked me to forward to him on degrees of imperial sovereignty. And the case is the ways in which, it's a piece that came out in Public Culture several years ago, and that's being reissued in this book. And it came out after 9/11. And it came out at the time in which there was a huge debate over whether there were lessons of empire to learn or not, and what we could do about it, and whether there could be a benevolent, and whether the U.S. was a benevolent empire or not, or a compassionate one. And so what I took as the case was the entire kind of archive of this space of discussion and of contestation around these terms, and why certain kinds of cases kept being put outside of that track. And try to understand what kind of logics would underwrite those concepts and what they very smoothly excise in using those concepts in that particular kind of way. And what comparisons were seen as viable. So what the politics of the comparison with England always were. Now, not at another time, as that moment of the present, right? The work on Palestine. So here we have one of the most critical areas, supposedly in the social sciences, post-colonial studies, right? Not in Frankfurt, mind you, not at the Goethe, but because it isn't. I mean, this is just not where there's been a lot of room for it. But in many other places, German colonial history is taking off recently, but it certainly has the last 25 years. One of the questions that I ask about our hot post-colonial studies in the beginning of this book, and I put it in the first chapter, is why Palestine and Israel and the U.S. involvement in Palestine and Israel have been excised from hot colonial studies for 25, 30 years. Now there's something very odd about this, not because Anne Stoller is interested in Palestine, not because I teach at Berzeit and in Ramallah, but because Edward Said's book, 1978 Orientalism, was written about the U.S. involvement in the Middle East. It was not written about 19th century literature and Emily Bronte. It was not written just about Orientalism and the iconography of Orientalism in the 18th century and the 19th century. It was written about now. His now in 1978. I asked why, a very uncomfortable question to ask among my colleagues in critical colonial studies, what happened to Israel and Palestine, but also how did this allow colonial studies not to be made comfortable for scholarship in 1990, when Nick Dirk says it gets comfortable in 1990, but already in 1978. And what is it that's proliferated in that field at the expense of so much of our history of the present now, and of the ways in which funds, military intelligence, technology has moved in these directions? So, the last 5 years, all of a sudden everybody's talking about settler colonialism, for the first time. Now, 2014. The other big piece of this introduction is that in 1978, Said wrote Orientalism. In 1979, he wrote The Dispossession of Palestine. The two books were set apart like that. One became the icon of colonial studies, Orientalism, read in every single class. Dispossession of Palestine, the problem of Palestine, all about colonialism, all about the present, all about was actually put aside as the political Said. One was the political Said, one was the domesticated Said for literary studies. I'm arguing what happens if we reconvene that history and look at those two books that have been brought together. So when you ask Clementine, am I trying to put myself on rough ground? I am. And if I don't do it at this point in my career, when do you do it? You don't do it when you're assistant professor trying to get tenure. You don't do it when you're in a difficult situation. You do it when you're in the cusp of disciplines, which I've always been, not much of an anthropologist, but where that present impinges on how we think, the concepts we use, and what we consider. And that's why I'm edgy and annoyed about the simplicity of saying ethnography offers rough ground. Because you still have to find it, you still have to make it. It's got to be yours. You know the field you're working in better than anyone, right? You know where you're giving it, and where you're going easy on yourself. And you're folding it into a story that's already been told too many times. How many much more imagery of Orientalists do we have to have dissertations on? What are we going to do with it? What? Unless more work is done with it in a new kind of way. So this is really very much a critique that's lodged at the field of which I've participated, and how my own work has been both part of that and trying to work both with and against that at the same time. So the early work that I did on intimacy and domesticity got kind of channeled into everyone doing work on the home and colonialism, right? But intimacy is extremely violent. Intimacy is in prisons. Intimacy is in so many other sites, so many other places, unwanted intimacies of all kinds. It needn't have been only about the front page with nursemaids on the cover. Why does it stay there? At its moment, it was an intervention, right? It was an intervention because that was not the political. But as Adiop Fier argues, there's something very intimate about torture. Very, very up close, very sensory. And so the critique that I've written of myself already in the second edition of Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power is a critique of that. So that for me is going to another place of the rough ground, right? Not the place. Let's all look at the nursemaids and the children and the households that is. That was fine at one moment. But if you continue to stay in that space, then you do yourself a disservice because you've kind of institutionalized it in some way. So what we do is, I think, really hard because you can never stay in the same place. It's kind of hard. But that's also why we're here. And I'm sure it's true in art as well. I mean, you can't keep making the same thing unless it's just as a commodity that sells well. I'm sure you can. So that's what these various projects are an effort to articulate. And it's kind of not a lecture, but some of the ground I'm trying to understand.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Then I would just ask one question about one topic you raised about the curative labor, and try to connect it with the earlier stuff you said about the problems and problematization. Foucault, and I think it's very accurate that Foucault said he's a diagnostician and not a physician, because he diagnoses problems but he does not cure them.
Yes.
And he says, I'm not interested in finding alternatives, but
Or a solution.
Or a solution. I want to study problems. And interestingly, Max Weber says pretty much the same in the essay on objectivity, which is interestingly again, especially in Frankfurt, regarded as a conservative kind of sociology, because he does not want to be critical, and critical for the Frankfurt tradition is always exactly giving solutions or normative orientation.
Right.
So I would be interested in what you think about the curative part of critique, or can critique be just saying, okay, here's the problem, and probably making things worse?
Right. Well, you do understand, and I hope this is clear, my use of curative labor is tongue-in-cheek. I don't mean that we should all be doing curative labor. I mean, that's what we take as our banner of what we're there for. What makes us feel good about having become anthropologists and philosophers is that we are curing the world of its prejudices. And we are the ones that do that. And we're always less prejudiced, and we always wear clothes that are ethnic at 3,000 people at an anthropology meeting. I mean, there's a whole, stereotype, cliche of the anthropologist as the most best do-gooder in the world. That curative labor for me is a tongue-in-cheek, that is not, in fact, what we can be curing the world of. That's not really in any way what I guess want to imagine what I do. But I think that diagnostician is an engaged kind of project that's not about resolution. And then, of course, people will go and say, so what's the point? Well, and then somebody else says, I'm going to go work in NGOs rather than in anthropology. And then they come back from the NGOs and say, well, the NGOs weren't doing very much. I think I'll go back to anthropology. No, but I mean, we're all struggling. I don't mean as an answer. I don't mean you all should be doing X or I should be doing X. But that issue of imagining that our interruptions are going to make, it's a little bit like anti-racist discourse. If only their attitudes were different, then everything would be better. Well, racism is much more structured into the world in which we live than changing people's attitudes. And that curative labor is partly very much based on a notion of that will change people's attitudes towards the other and make them tolerant. Well, Wendy Brown's written some really great things on the politics of tolerance and how intolerant tolerance is as a concept. But that's a lot of what multiculturalism anthropology has been invested in, right? So, and then of course there's Slaughter who says, look, your whole generation is full of cynics. Is that all we can do is do cynical critique, right? Johannes.
Thanks for your talk. I wanna raise 2 points that connect connect your curative labor back to the curative labor philosophy, because I kind of felt now maybe try to think about that connection again. First of all, I really like this idea of critique, if you want to call it, about being guided by an ethics of discomfort, being something very physical, something that's stressful. Like
Mal à l'aise.
I actually realized that I really like this the Anti-Oedipus from Deleuze so much and really have in common because it uses this
Which are you reading?
the first of the capitalism and schizophrenia. Because it uses the image of schizophrenia, a really mental suffering, as a heuristic to think about thinking, think about thought. And I think that's true. I think there's a lot of the critique is very, very close to suffering, it's very, very physical.
That's great.
It's very physical in a way.
There's a quote for you. Can I footnote it, or do you want to keep going? Then I'll footnote it.
Footnote it.
Okay.
But that also connects to, I think, the second side of philosophy. And that's something that philosophy always, this kind of classic theme of philosophy, to be about friendship, be about people.
Yes.
And because it's so much about suffering, that actually it's very, very difficult to utter it, to have an ethics of discomfort. You need to be in some kind of realm that gives you a comfort in some other
That's
way.
right.
And I mean, if you think about it that way, then we can start talking about the whole politics of academic work for young people in particular. How much discomfort are we actually allowed
Exactly.
to utter?
No question.
Well, that's exactly what I was saying before, also about this disruption that is not too disruptive, and it depends where you speak from, and the situated point at which you are. And I mean, none of it, there's no like checklist, because it all changes depending on where you are, where you're placed, whether you're a man or a woman, what universe, absolutely.
And the second point, I think, I'm not sure if this has ever been written about really, but if you think about philosophy being about suffering and hurting people, then if you look at German philosophy in post Second World War times, then there's always, particularly in critical theory, there's a lot of discussion about the philosopher as part of a kind of fascist system of thought. And you will have Adorno, we'll see Adorno uttering all the skepticism about how much philosophy can actually still do, but sticking to it, kind of go, I think he's trying to go through this discomfort in a certain way, if you like it or not. And what more contemporary philosophy does is to be very aware of the suffering, to be very aware of the danger of philosophy, but then to say, just dispense judgment. Just say, well, this is something to be decided by democratic negotiations. I mean, the philosopher cannot, they create a realm that is... and it's something that turns up very often in conferences to have people say, well, after the Second World War, it's just not possible for us intellectuals to think about these things, to say something about this. It's a very common theme, I think, but probably particularly in Germany. And as such, it's interesting that your stance, also coming from a different tradition, I think it's very different. It's just as attuned to the same problem.
This is very interesting what you say. I mean, there's a lot to say about it. But I was just writing in French, the thing that I'm giving, and I was rereading in French Foucault's piece on genealogy as critique. And one of the things that he argues is that it is genealogy which gets to our nervous system, right? It's exactly this. It is genealogy that not only touches the body, I mean, everybody knows it touches the body, but not what he meant by it touching. That it actually, where we dispense our energies, how we dispense them. I never had noticed that line before on its, what it does to your own nervous system. And critique as this sort of mobilizing of your nervous system, but not more than mobilizing it, just encompassing that is really interesting. So I'm not sure it's just, I like this idea that critique is suffering. But I wonder if it is, suffering goes very close. Suffering for what? To whom? For whom? I always want suffering for something else, or is it suffering from that very position in which you're located, of the impossibility of that position? So Jay Bernstein, the first thing he says, philosophy is impossible. He starts the course, and when I taught the graduate seminar in FIELDWORK and philosophy, I invited him to the first class. He said, let me tell you all, I love that philosophers can say declarative sentences. Philosophy is impossible. Right? And that is part, what I don't like and what I love about it. But maybe it's that occupying that space of impossibility that's so interesting, that produces that suffering. Outside, again, it's Nietzsche's thing of outside, maybe get outside comfort zones. How do you not stay within your comfort zone and reproduce it again and again? And how does your own critique that you've been so invested in not become another comfort zone? That's the problem, right? Unless it's revised, it's no longer critique.
I sort of have a question. I mean, the project that you sort of outlined can be shared by all of the social sciences and humanities, actually. Any critical academic would say, yes, this is precisely what we have to do. Do you see, for example, anthropology as making a particular type of contribution or a particular way of accessing common ground, or are you saying, no, that's just sort of a matter of, where I got my disciplinary training, and after that, it doesn't really matter?
I think it does have something really special. And I think it has to do with how we conceive of what our project is, that we have to know how to listen and to hear and to see. I think we put a lot of focus on that, and not with the expectation that it's going to be easily and ready-made, right? That either the difference or the sameness.
Maybe it's also perhaps sort of openness to other people's rough ground that they presented us. We can.
I don't know if we've done that yet, though. I'm not sure how much that we've actually been able to identify. That's great. Other people's rough ground.
Right. I mean, this was just something that occurred to me. I'm like, well, if we're talking about rough ground, well, when we do field work, people will bring rough ground to us. We may sort of not take note of it or not be attuned to it because we're so busy trying to, get the monograph together. But maybe that would be sort of a place for anthropology to go, is to be open to the rough grounds of.
But the rough ground, not necessarily. I think you're absolutely right, but not the rough ground necessarily where you expect it to be. So I was in South Africa after apartheid, and I was on the beach, at a beach that very lefty friends of mine said was integrated. Well, according to me, it wasn't. There were people of color sitting on one side, and there were people who were white sitting on another, but they were on the same beach. And my daughter and I went up to some rocks where a bunch of young guys were sitting, sort of distant. And how do I put this? I don't know. I thought I knew what was going on, like that I wanted to be able to show in some ways that I understood that this was not integrated. And I knew there were all kind of complications in me being there the way I was. And they moved the subject somehow to the fact that whites are allowed to have psychological problems, but people who are poor and black aren't. They're supposed to be so racked with their poverty that psychology, that depression wasn't for them. That depression is a middle class issue. And it was like they changed the entire ground of what the conversation was about. It wasn't about poverty. It wasn't about what I expected. It wasn't about race. It was about changing the actual terrain of the possibility of the conversation. And I'm not sure if that is what we're always trying to find a way to do in anthropology, is not go in with what you perceive already. I'm going to do a study on poverty and race in South Africa. But what actually emerges in a different kind of constellation. And I don't know, what others think. This is certainly not me alone. What do others think? What do you imagine is the rough ground? I think what you just said is really important. I mean, other people's, not your own, but what other people's could possibly be.
Because, rough ground, our perceptions of rough ground or what we can perceive as rough ground is also already conditioned by, our training, our background, whatever. So, if we're just going around and for ourselves identifying it, we're sort of operating again in a closed space of rough ground.
And is it the same, is what we were talking about before, is it really identifying what's a problem for people in the world? In the sense that Paul Rabinowitz tries to get at problematization, and takes that from Foucault. What's a problem in the world? And how much is your analytic problem that you're imagining is going to be your dissertation or your book or your next article actually a problem that is there for other people in the world, and how much do those two line up? Is that actually the space of rough ground, or is there something else in that that's more visceral, affective as well? I guess that's where my own charge goes, is that unless the sensory, unless the affective is part of that.
Well, I'm just interpreting, but I think that Foucault's rough ground is this part of curative labor. So I would partly disagree to your discussion because, of course, curative labor is kind of tongue-in-cheek because somehow you are parochial. But on the other side, there's assumptions that, that Foucault was criticized to be a nihilist. And this really got to his heart, and all his work in the aesthetics of existence and his discussion about parietia is to give impulses, not give ready-made answers, but give impulses, so there is a reflection on possibility to reflect maybe how to find your own background.
So in some ways, what's interesting is you're returning to something that I've been trying to get to as I was trying to distinguish, but I'm not sure it's right, between Paul Ravenel's work and my own. How important this parietia is to maybe the rough ground. That rough ground has to be, in some sense, defined by the risk, by the fearless speech. But as I was thinking and rereading Paul on the new stuff on Richter, and he's always moving. We do it in very different ways. It doesn't have to be better or worse. It's different. It's different. And I think that maybe that parietia and that rough ground, actually, that fearlessness, how to arrive at fearlessness, even when you are fearful, how to take that risk anyway, right? Can the rough be something of which you are not taking a risk upon? I don't think. I think it has to be. So there's something very, that's a different kind of compulsion than what we talk about in the social sciences. That really takes you in a different kind of way.
My question is can we really enter rough ground if we still hold allegiances onto the sorts of fields we come from? And let me just explain how I got to that question. I'm thinking about how to think the other, or how to find other thinking. And I'm also aware that a lot of what comes outside of a we or an us, whatever that might be, starts from a question not of what we can find, what they can find, but how do we protect what we have? What do we already have, and how do we protect it? And so I'm wondering, say from my...
How do we protect it, or why we want to protect it as well? I mean, when you say how to protect it, you already assume something. How to protect it.
Yeah.
Are there questions that come, why would I even protect that, or why would I relinquish that?
Well, I think the first question is, what do I have?
Yes.
Or what do we have?
Yeah.
And everything follows on from that.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, if I come from an art discipline, and I try to enter that, I need to be aware that the discipline is going to find any difference, and going to make any difference, is going to kind of move through any difference and pull any difference into the kind of mass of what is possible for that discipline.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how do I even think or find another way to think if I'm still attached to my discipline without giving up my ground? How do I find rough ground without giving up my ground? And is that possible?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know, because I've never felt possessive about anthropology. In fact, if anything, I've made whatever interventions I've had made almost on its edges or outside of it altogether. But I think some of the most interesting work happening now is actually questioning what do we have and what is it to have it? What is the having? So anthropology went through this crisis. We have fieldwork. And then various people go, well, what's fieldwork? Where is fieldwork? What do you mean by fieldwork? What do you mean you have it? We have ethnography. We, and now everybody in every field says we do ethnography, but what do you mean you have ethnography? Like, what does that possessive do? It's a question, it's a great question because it's happening as a question in so many places. What is it to hold on to that? And the person who some of you don't know, but who we've been referring to, Paul Rabinow, is somebody who's asked that question a lot, right, of his own. Because people go, that's not field work. Or what are you doing it there for? Or people say, what do you mean you're doing field work in the archives, Anne? What do you mean you're doing ethnography in the archives? I mean, that's not ethnography. No. So what's your ethnography? Right? What is it that you possess there? It gives you a signature of empowerment. So I feel like there's something going on now that is both, a threat to some people, but incredibly enlivening in that relinquishing of what that space is of ownership. What happens when you don't own it?
For some people, their badge of honor is taken. I mean, it's traumatic. What are you left with? They have to ask, what are you left with? It's a question that anthropology some anthropologists like to avoid, because it's very difficult. You don't have some material.
Well, it's happening, you can see it with the doctoral, students all the time. But if you repose the question as, what are you asking and why are you asking it, and how much you go about addressing it, rather than what is it I own? What's the question, and why does that question matter to ask? The possessive seems to really be put aside. You're gonna exploit, you're gonna use all kinds of resources to do that. You're gonna be in a different position to see them, not take this boîte d'outils, this box of tools that Foucault gave us, but actually, is that a tool? Is that really a tool for me in this situation? What might I do to refashion it? It seems like the question seems crucial. How one asks a question, rather than what is it that, and this is hard. I'm not trying to be disingenuous and say that's not easy, that it's easy for a student or a young scholar. But it seems very liberating in some ways.
But it's not just a question. I think it's also, if I try and understand what you're saying, it's also about a kind of methodology.
Absolutely.
And I remember 10, 15 years ago, I wrote a paper on being it sounds ridiculous, but it had its reason, of being an institutional transvestite. In other words, of making sure that in order to find an area of freedom of research within an institution, I had to constantly shift the institution's expectation of what my role would be. So I would do university setup and pervert the budget for an exhibition. I would do university setup very early on in 98 in a Kunsthalle. I would do something museological in a university. Now I take over an ethnographic museum, and it's totally clear to me that there are processes of occlusion in the ethnographic museum which have to do very clearly with administration and disciplinary divisions and certain self-sufficiencies. And I think when Luke talks about trying to find a space for other thinking within art practice at the moment, it's equally complicated. And when you start sort of talking about the current politics of university research or the current politics of museum exposure and the way people show artists and what's expected from audiences, you see very quickly that you revert unavoidably to a kind of topical language form. So you can speak
Right.
about the absence of projet in major institutions today. So the majority of museum directors are brought in because they're career professionals, and they will go from one museum to another museum to another museum, and very few of them have a projet, a concept, right? And it's this problem of looking at the occlusions of the current, not the contemporary, but what is going on now, which is, I think, something where, for me, curative labor would be very interesting, extremely interesting, and where the rough ground really lies is at the moment you talk about a wonderful term of congested exchanges. Well, the congested exchanges are not just congested, they're being suffocated. It's suffocated exchanges that are going on.
Yeah.
And I wonder about this idea, you say, what disciplines think their task is. That's the curative labor.
Absolutely.
To think about what your discipline, but when you are not sure that your discipline, you know that you've been nurturing a way outwards of your discipline. And if you remain within it, you're actually congested. So then to say, okay, should I move into philosophy as an artist? Because there at least I can talk about things. But you then come into another institutional framework of occlusion and of highly problematic political moves forward.
Well, this is so interesting. Ernesto, who's not here today, this is exactly what he said he got caught with. He wanted to work on Spinoza and do ethnography, and so he went to the philosophy department at Nanterre, and they said, well, you can work on Spinoza, but forget the fieldwork. And then he went to the anthropology at Nanterre, and they said, do the fieldwork, but please don't cite Spinoza.
Was there another question? Just wanted to say something directly to that. I often feel these tensions, but somehow, as frustrating as they are, and also they always risk of destroying the work or blocking it at the outset, they're also extremely productive. I mean, constantly being in a state of friction and banging your head against these walls also makes it very, very clear to you what it is you're trying to break down. If you didn't have that, and you just had absolute freedom and everything was perfect and wonderful, you know, this creative energy wouldn't be there.
But that's the problem, the romanticism of transgression that you just
That's
spoke
what I
about.
was trying
and
to
that's
write
why
about.
to
Yeah.
believe that the rough ground is
Right.
the other
Right.
is romantic. To
It's-
believe that the other will give you rough ground.
And that's
is
part of the
utterly
ontological
romantic.
term. That's the
Utterly
ontological term.
romantic proposition, which I can't work like that. That's a classic anthropologist's vision, is that the native will provide exactly everything that
Well,
you
it's
don't
not,
know about.
it's not that they provide it. It's the fact that you're having this clash is like an attention getter. It's not that this is going to per se be a productive moment. It's what you can manage to make out of that. It forces you to make something out of that. So I'm not really trying to romanticize it, but it's simply you're stuck in a bind, and at that moment, you've got to figure out, okay, what can I do with this? Am I going to sit here and just be in a bind? Am I going to start singing, or what am I going to do with this? And that's what I mean by I don't want to romanticize it, but I think friction is important. Just because it forces you have to do something with it.
Sure. I think that's kind of pretty clear. I mean,
Well, some people are like very happy in their sort of homogenous group of scholars, and they never have an argument. They're all in perfect agreement, and they think what they're doing is perfectly
But
important.
I think what Clinton is also saying is that it's one of the conventions of anthropology that we imagine that by being anthropologists, we're going to have immediate access to that moment of clash, in some way. And that clash is a signature. And then we go and we resolve it, and then we write partly about how we dealt with the clash, and that we misunderstood that a hat was a box, and that, you know what I mean, that whole thing of, it's maybe what we do with it rather than, it becomes a trope in some way, and it's not our fault. It's not, it's so institutionalized, it's so much the way proposals are written, it's so much the way books are introduced, It's so much the way the first chapter is supposed to look in a sort of smug little, isn't that funny? You know, boy, I got that one wrong, boy, am I stupid, now I'm so smart, because now I understand X. There's a convention that we've assumed, not you, me, the whole, that I wonder if it's just too easy, too smooth, too bourgeois and happy. It's almost, it's like doing the Grand Tour in the 19th century. There's something about it, we'll have our other, come through our lives, get our PhDs with the other, and move on. And, you know, I mean, anthropology has had angst over it for many decades, you know, that at least we're thinking about it, one could argue. Other disciplines don't worry about it as much. But it's definitely taken us on the edge of what, you know, how anthropology is practiced in a lot of places. Which is why people are trying to do it in all different kinds of places. There are a few things. Let me work in the Federal Reserve. Let me work in the European Union, you know, Senate. People are trying to find, like, what isn't conventional space of difference? Where it's so similar it hurts. I don't know if we just revert back anyway to how we do it. I don't know. But I know it's an issue. It's on the table.
Can I just slightly rephrase my
Please.
question?
I love your what do we have?
I think I didn't say it so clearly, but all I'm talking about, or what I'm getting at, is wondering if there's a way to avoid the clash and to avoid the kind of narcissistic self-reflection. And so on one hand we have a community, and this community is about using the medium of critique to expand. And on the other hand, we have a community that's always been defined in deficit. And so its first step of expansion is to account.
Or not deficit, or in amplitude of the real.
So I'm just wondering how those two communities can ever speak to each other. Because one seems to be...
Well, you're already assuming they're communities.
Well, I mean, I'm just sketching it out
But, right.
to not ask a too abstract
Right.
question. But how can they speak to each other? If one is kind of creating a big account as their first step.
Well, one of the ways anthropologists have tried to do it is instead of looking upon one another, is to do something together. And that's what, I mean, this is an issue that so many people have put their heads to. So instead of producing an ethnography, because I come from Goethe University or Columbia University or New School, we're going to do this together. I'm giving you, I have video cameras. We're going to share them. I have 3 computers. We're both going to work on them together. We're going to set out, as Steve Lansing did, the irrigation system in Bali. You're going to tell me how you figured out when to shut the water off. I'm going to put it on my computer. We're going to do it together. I mean, there's ways in which, instead of speaking, people have said, okay, how do we do this with shared knowledge? That is not better knowledge, more knowledge, qualified knowledge, disqualified knowledge, but actually knowledge that actually comes into the same space in which I'm not the interpreter of your knowledge, in which we are actually producing it simultaneously together. Early anthropologists tried to, give the video camera to the kids, let them do it, I think one could chronicle this enormously creative, diverse ways which people have tried to do it. I'm not saying that they haven't worked or that they have. It's just that it's an ongoing set of experiments. People no longer talk about their informants. They won't use the term anymore. What is it that people are using?
There's 2. There's collaborators.
Collaborators.
And interlocutor.
Yeah, and interlocutors, right? The smile over here at the other end.
It's 7:45.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Goodness. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Thank you all for really interesting discussion and for coming.